Well, thank you very much, Dr. Robinson. I'm very honored and pleased and overwhelmed by the erudition of this audience, having heard some of the lectures this morning, and what an honor indeed it is to be here. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the world's fastest airplane, how it got that way, tell you about the man who created it. He is indeed the world's greatest aeronautical designer since the advent of aviation, and perhaps you haven't even heard of him. Before I do, however, I wanted to mention my connection with this group. I'm a longtime subscriber to the newsletter Access to Energy, and before Dr. Robinson had it, it was Dr. Peter Beckman. I was subscribing to it at that time as well. I'm interested in energy itself per se. I don't recall whether it was that or because I'm a big fan of Edward Teller from way, way back. And before I get going into aviation, I want to give you a little anecdote about Edward Teller that I recall. It seems to me, it must have been back in the 50s, they used to have Meet the Press, and they had 4 questioners. And one of them, and he was the guest, one of the questioners said, "Dr. Teller, does it bother you that Professor Kistiakowsky of Harvard and others and blah, 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 blah?" And the question lasted about 2.5 minutes. And remember, it started with, "Does it bother you?" So as soon as the questioner ceased talking, he said, "No." Over the years, I've had a lot of fun remembering that. They didn't give you much of my background, so I was going to tell you first of all about my background, how I got to be where I was involved with all this high-speed aviation stuff. I'm born and raised in Memphis, Tennessee. I like to say me and Elvis. We're here in Las Vegas, and they have a man, this mayor named Oscar. He has a one-man name for recognition, sort of like Madonna. And I'm told that he goes out and makes presentations, and he carries his own Elvis impersonator with him. And my best friend, even today, over in Memphis, is named Stephen Toof Brown. And his aunt was named Grace Toof, T-O-O-F, a Dutch name. She married a doctor, and then they built a beautiful home on the south side of the city, and it's named for her, Graceland. And then Elvis came along and bought it, and that's a fairly famous place too. And my first cousin right now is in charge of the Presley estate from a financial standpoint over there in Memphis. So I went to, World War II came along, so I joined the Navy at age 17, went up to Great Lakes Boot Camp, just north of Chicago on Lake Michigan. And I'd wanted to get into aviation, but they were not having any more pilots because they were downsizing at the tail end of the war. And so then I tried to scheme to get into submarines, which I was working on when I got this appointment to the U.S. Naval Academy. And so I wound up going there. And I graduated in 1949, and the class ahead of me at Annapolis had not gotten to Pensacola for flight training. The class ahead of them had not gotten there. They were out on the surface fleet. So what happened was, in 1947, they created the U.S. Air Force out of the Army Air Corps. So West Point said, "We're giving no more boys to this new service. It's not part of the Army." And the first Secretary of Defense was James Forrestal. So he said, when the generals in the Air Force complained, they said, "Well, we'll make them do it till they get an Air Force Academy." And so then West Point said, "Why should we do that? Annapolis is a third service, and they aren't providing any people." So then he said, "All right, I'll make them do it too." So Navy got dragged in the back door, and they were furious, I can assure you. And so then they told Forrestal, "This isn't fair to the people here at Annapolis. They are coming in here thinking they're going in the Marine Corps or the Navy, and now you're going to make them go in the Air Force, some of them." So then the upshot of that was it'd be on a voluntary basis only. So this 3-star general from the Air Force came over to Annapolis 30 days before I was due to graduate. And he said, "Any of you boys who qualify that go into the Air Force, we're going to send you immediately into flight training." So that sounded good to me, so I didn't care what uniform I wore. So I volunteered and got accepted. And they gave you a brand new physical. Even though we already had a Navy physical, that didn't cut any ice with these other guys. And also they split you up, upper third, middle, or lower academically. You wanted to get a cross-section of the class. And 15% volunteered, and 6% was the most they were going to take. So I lucked out and got into that. I was then qualified for aviation and in the upper third. So they sent me down there to West Point of the Air, Randolph Field, San Antonio, Texas, and that's where I soloed in a T-6 airplane. And we had 30 Annapolis people and about 110 West Pointers down there. And so then I went from there to Chandler, Arizona to fly the 80. And that was designed by one Clarence L. Johnson, nicknamed Kelly Johnson. He's the one I'm going to tell you about. Little knowing, and what an irony it is, that later I was his main test pilot. And the 80 was the first successful jet in America. And that alone would have made him famous. But I'll continue giving you a little more bio on me, and then we can talk about Kelly Johnson. By the way, the program here today, I'm told by Jeremy, will be 1 hour, and we're going to save 15 minutes for questions and answers. And there will be a short video about 2/3 of the way through, about 5.5 minutes long, showing the airplane in flight and taking off, etc. The SR-71 Blackbird I'm talking about. So I went from, before the Korean War broke out, then I had volunteered for Germany, Europe, and they had some 80s at Fürstenfeldbruck over there. And so this good friend of mine, Jimmy Hardinger, came. He had volunteered too, and so he comes to me one day and says, well, we got good news and bad news. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I got Fürstenfeldbruck where they have the 80, and that's called the P-80 Shooting Star. All of Lockheed's products were named for heavenly bodies. And so I said, well, what have I got? He said, you got P-47 propellers. And I said, oh, this thing's ancient history. And so I went to Munich, Germany. But then shortly thereafter, both units got re-equipped with straight-wing 84 Thunderjets made by Republic Aviation, Farmingdale, Long Island. And then that's 2 years later, I went to Korea and was flying the very same airplane in the Korean War out of K2 Airport, Daegu, Korea. And I was always grateful for the fact that I knew the airplane cold turkey when I got into combat, whereas some of these reservists and Air Guard people only had 20 or 30 hours before they were flying combat. That's not a good thing. So then I had to return to Germany because when the boys in Korea were finishing up, then they weren't eligible for reassignment overseas again, and so the war had been going on 1.5 years, and the people in Germany didn't have anybody with any Korean jet experience. And so I volunteered, but I had to sign a piece of paper. If I didn't get bumped off, I'd have to return to Europe and extend, which I said, that's fine with me, so that's what I did. And so in the meanwhile, our unit got re-equipped with 86 Sabre jets made in Columbus, Ohio. And when I flew that thing, I thought, this is the world's best airplane right here. And then later, when I flew the F104, I thought, this is the world's best airplane. Later, the SR-71, that's the world's best airplane. So that's really, so when I left Germany, I went and became a test pilot at Eglin Air Force Base, Florida. So the way this works in R&D, research and development, at Edwards Air Force Base, you get an experimental airframe, you get an experimental engine, and once you get that thing going fairly well together, then you ship it over there to Eglin, and they make a complete operational vehicle out of it for the customer, and it does all the bombs, gun sights, fuses, and so forth. And they drop live ordnance over the Gulf of Mexico. And very few test pilots have been stationed at both places. So that's a unique thing about my background too. That's what enabled me to be hired by Lockheed, by the way, because I was a military test pilot over there in Florida and had an opportunity to fly everything in the inventory, at least slightly, just out of my own curiosity to see what I could learn about it and what I liked or disliked about it. So then I got hired by Lockheed, and now I'm going to tell you about Kelly Johnson. He was born in upstate Michigan. and he's from a very poor family. And he went to Flint Junior College, and then he went to Ann Arbor, and a graduate of University of Michigan. And they had one of the only wind tunnels, and just a handful of wind tunnels in those days in the United States. And he got a job working for the man who ran the Michigan wind tunnel, grading papers, etc. When he told me he worked his way through school, I said, "How did you do that? The classical way, waiting on tables, etc.?" He said, "Well, a little bit of that, but mainly tutoring the dullards." That gives you an insight right there into his persona. As I look at Kelly Johnson, he is a rare combination of extraordinary common sense and outstanding book sense. He knew science and also tremendous dedication. So he came out to Lockheed, and they said, "Well, we don't have enough business." Lockheed was bought in bankruptcy for $40,000 in 1933, and the man and his partners was named Robert Gross and his brother Cortland Gross. And so when it sold at bankruptcy, the judge says, "Bang," and he looks over his desk and says, "Well, young man, I sure hope you know what you're doing." Lockheed right now is the largest defense contractor in America. And it was already a world-famous name. Wiley Post had a Lockheed airplane. He flew around the world. And I believe when Kelly Johnson got out there, he knew more aerodynamics than anybody at Lockheed already, just as a student coming from Michigan. And by the way, he was pure-blooded Swedish. And his brother worked for Flint, Michigan, for Buick, where they make Buick. And he came out when Kelly Johnson died in December 1990. And I'd heard about the brother, but never met him before. And I like to sometimes tease with a straight face, even though it was at a funeral. I said to his brother, I said, "What was your area of expertise there at Buick?" He says, "Hydraulics." And I said, "Do you think you know more hydraulics than Kelly?" And he looked at me like, "That's an amazing question." He said, "Of course." And I assure you, I'm here to tell you, Kelly Johnson thought he was an expert on hydraulics for all these airplanes he designed. So he was only 27 years old when he designed the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. And at that time, Howard Hughes held the world speed record in the H-1 racer, and he was certain he's going to get a big contract for Hughes Aircraft to build a fighter for the Army Air Corps. And he would have too, were it not for Kelly and his P-38. And so that airplane was in production at the time of Pearl Harbor and still in production at the end of the war. And our two leading aces and two leading American aces were Dick Bong of Appleton, Wisconsin, Poplar, Wisconsin. And he had 40 victories in World War II, and all of them were in a P-38. And the number 2 man was Thomas McGuire of New Jersey. He had 38 victories. And he also was operating exclusively in P-38s, not P-51s, not Hellcats, not P-47s, all of them in 38s. And so that alone would have made Kelly famous at age 27 to design this thing. And so because of his reputation, even then, and he was, when World War II hit, America had no gas turbine programs going at all. But the Germans did, and the British did. And the British program was done by Frank Whittle, later Sir Frank Whittle, and I knew him too. And so they told Kelly to design an airframe for this new jet engine. And General Electric at that time was building turbo superchargers for reciprocating engines. And that's a high RPM device that increases air pressure to improve performance on the reciprocating engines. And by the way, that helped win World War II also. And so it sounds like a gas turbine is simply a high RPM device that moves air too, so they asked GE if they could duplicate this engine called the NEAN engine, N-E-N-E. In Britain, in the early days, they named all their engines for rivers, and that's a river in Britain. And so Kelly told me that he asked them, what does this thing weigh and what are its dimensions? And they told him, it's so secret we don't know, but we'll soon let you know as soon as we find out. So he said he obviated the question of the weight by putting it on the center of gravity, and he oversized the fuselage to be sure it would fit in there. And that was the origin of the Lockheed Skunk Works, by the way. It was so secret, nobody could tell anybody what they were doing. And Kelly, one reason he's not as well known is because he was always on the cutting edge of technology and involved in so many secret things, and including the U-2 and the SR-71, and I'll talk about them a little bit later. Whereas, say, Chuck Yeager, you've heard of him, and he didn't do all this secret stuff. And the astronauts, you've heard of them, they're anything but secret too. And so, this group here, and especially Dr. Teller, helped win the Cold War, but so did Kelly Johnson. And in fact, concerning the U-2, I'd just like to mention it while I'm thinking about it. The Senate head of the Armed Forces Committee was John C. Stennis. He was deemed so important they've named a nuclear aircraft carrier after him right now. And so he said of the U-2, he said, it saved us, America, more money than anything I can think of, because it enabled us to get knowledge of what was going on in Russia and what programs should be replicated, which ones should not, and so forth. That was what he was talking about. Anyway, back to Kelly. So he creates this 80, and the engines are very unreliable at first, naturally. But GE made the engine, and on August 6, 1945, that's the exact date that America dropped the first atomic bomb. And by the way, I saw just this morning, I got a chronology of Dr. Teller, and it said that he opposed dropping it on the city at first. But I am here to tell you my opinion is he was mistaken about that. He wasn't mistaken about very much, but I believe that had they not done it the way they did, we'd have had to necessitate that invasion anyway. And I have a good friend, Louis Zamperini. He went down in a B-24 and was in a rubber life raft 47 days. And he's a POW in Japan at that time. And the Japanese had announced already that the first time an American soldier sets foot on mainland Japan, we're going to execute all American prisoners, 140,000 of them. And I'm sure they would have done that. At any rate, so then the Skunk Works came about, and it got the name because Al Capp was the cartoonist from Massachusetts, and remember he had Dogpatch, Kentucky, Daisy May, Little Abner, and so forth. And somebody called over there to telephone to the Skunk Works and said, what are you all doing over there? And of course it's so secret they couldn't tell anybody. And they really did adhere to this stuff to the nth degree. And the joke was, well, we're cooking up some joy juice or something like that. And that's where it all came from. It sounds like the Skunk Works is what's happening, but nobody knew what exactly that meant. But it was the first successful jet in America. And so I have a friend that's still alive. Keller's right-hand man is age 90 now, and he lives out in California. And he told me that in 1947, he got a letter from the U.S. Air Force saying, all right, it's been very controversial. A lot of people said, we don't even need a two-seated 80. But they said, we're going to finally decide we're going to buy some. We're going to buy 12, but tell all your subcontractors we'll never buy any more than that. And some pilots, and Yeager was one of them, saying, I don't see why we need a two-seater. Anybody ought to be able to jump in this thing and go. And so at any rate, instead of buying 12, they ultimately bought 5,700 of those two-seaters. And they were very useful, and they taught introduction to jets. 95% of the free world jet fighter pilots were introduced to jets in that Lockheed T-33, or T-Bird is his nickname. So then at the tail end of the war, Kelly Johnson designed an airplane that revolutionized commercial airplanes, and that was the Lockheed Constellation. And it had 3 tails, you may remember, and a graceful looking fuselage. And what was unique about it, it was the first commercial airplane to carry a whole lot of people that would comfortably have enough range to go from New York or Washington to Paris or London. And prior to that, with lack of range, they all had to go up to Goose Bay or Gander and then jump over to Greenland or Iceland or into Prestwick, Scotland or Shannon, Ireland. And that's what I had to do when I flew the Lockheed Jetstar. When we had no more SR-71 flying at Lockheed, then I started flying the chairman of the board around in another private corporate jet called the Jetstar, and Kelly designed that thing too, and the production was over in Marietta, Georgia. And they have a lot of other stuff going in Marietta, Georgia. In the speech this morning from Dr. Sally, which I saw, she mentioned that they have a Hercules in the background, and that's another product of the Lockheed Skunk Works and Kelly Johnson. That airplane, by the way, she mentioned the JATO takeoff. And the Hercules, or the C-130 as most people call it, has been in production longer than any other airplane in the history of aviation. It was in production in the 50s and then 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and right now the one is called the C-130J, also being produced in Marietta, Georgia. And 70 different countries have it, and then other countries would like to have it, but their politics aren't right. And so that's quite a feat itself. And speaking of JATO, I'd just like to digress a moment and mention out at Caltech and JPL, March Field is nearby in Riverside, and Hap Arnold was a bird colonel, and he was in charge of March Field, and he knew about the Guggenheim chamber and tunnel over there at Caltech, and he knew the man that ran the Mission Inn in Riverside. And the Mission Inn is still there. It's a historic, beautiful place, and I urge you to go if you haven't been there before. It's where Nixon got married, among other things, and many presidents have stayed there. And they have an aviation wall there. And anyway, when Hap Arnold, he was the only 5-star general, by the way, the Air Force has at all. And when he became in charge of the money back in DC, he contacted Caltech and said, I want to start up an R&D arm, and he could fund it. And so Theodore von Karman was the first, he was the man in charge of aerodynamics at Caltech, famous fellow. And he became the first director of JPL. That was the origin of JPL. And so their first product, according to Hap Arnold, was to try to devise a suitable JATO bottle. That stands for Jet Assisted Takeoff. And you can mount these bottles on the fuselage and punch them, and they only have about 15 to 20 seconds of power, but that's just enough to get the gear up, and then the drag goes down, and then you can fly off with a heavier load, and that's been very useful. When I was a fighter pilot in Korea, in fact, we have a single-seat, single-engine Thunderjet, and we'd put 2 1,000-pounders on it frequently, and we'd fill it up with fuel, and we could go way up north, and we would have to JATO takeoffs for doing that. And it's a big help, and it worked good. And then after you, then you fly out there by the Naktong River, and you jettison the things and reduce the external drag on the airplane. So it works good in that sense. And they still use it. Maybe you've seen the Blue Angels. They have a C-130 called Fat Albert, and they do a JATO thing along with the Blue Angels when you see performances there with Fat Albert. So where was it? So after Kelly Johnson did the Constellation, he did the F-94 Starfighter, which was a fighter interceptor squadron aircraft, and it was the first one that had afterburner, which is a different condition for the tail end of the airplane to get extra thrust. It's very fuel inefficient, however. And then suddenly the Korean War breaks out. And so the co-founder of North American Aviation, Lee Atwood, who passed away about 3 years ago, and a good friend of mine, he and Kelly went over to Korea and interviewed the pilots and said, what kind of machine do you think you want? They both, all of them said, we want something that's superior to the opponent in performance. So Mr. Atwood came back and headed the North American design of the F-100 Super Sabre, which is about a 1.5 airplane, and Kelly comes back and designs the F104 Starfighter, and that's the one that I was test pilot for Lockheed on as well. And it was a Mach 2 airplane, And I was first impressed with it because as you go faster in these things, it gets hotter and aluminum is weaker. So we couldn't go faster than 2.0 because things are heating up. It's analogous to the Concorde, which is also an aluminum airplane. I was just talking with my luncheon partner here earlier about the Columbia missile, you know, the shuttle. It's aluminum and it's got these protective tiles. And what happened was they just dinged a small little hole in that Columbia back in March 1st, 03. And then as it starts re-entering the atmosphere, heat becomes the problem. And that heat gets in there and by conduction, it goes around the frame of the shuttle and then it weakens it. And then it can't withstand the Q or the load, aerodynamic load on it as it keeps going faster. And that's why it weakens and then comes apart. That's what happened to the Columbia. So the F104, by the way, currently holds the world low altitude speed record. And I was involved in that. We did it up in Mud Lake, Nevada. My friend Daryl Greenemeyer and I, and he's won more unlimited Reno air races than anybody else. And you would think that when the Concorde, when America had a supersonic program, commercial jet program, and it got canceled. But the British and French didn't. They had the Concorde. So when Gerald Ford was president, then the Congress passed a law that no non-military airplane can go supersonic over the continental United States. And so we had a 104, Greenemeyer and I, but it had been put together with different parts and it had no provenance as a particular 104. And so nobody had ever asked for a permission a waiver of this law because we were a non-military airplane. And so I went over there to DC and talked the FAA into giving us a waiver, which was not all that easy to do since nobody had ever asked for one before. And the pitch I used was that we're going to do this test up there at Mud Lake, Nevada near Tonopah, and there's nothing out there, no cattle to curdle their milk if you drop sonic booms on them. There's nothing out there really except jackrabbits and rattlesnakes. So they agreed with that and let us do it, and that's why the 104 currently holds the world low altitude speed record. What does low altitude mean? That means from sea level, from surface of the ground level to 100 meters up and no in between that. That'd be about like 335 feet or so. And you have to make 4 passes and you have to time it in microseconds and then translate that into speed, and you get a mean speed. All world records are held in Paris and it's all metric, and it's been that way since day one. And so the SR-71 is the world's fastest and has been for over 40 years. And so Kelly Johnson's got both ends of the speed spectrum to himself. Now I wanted to talk about the U-2. At the same time that Kelly designed the U-2, its forte is high altitude, but not all that fast. It goes about 500 miles an hour, and it goes, I was a good friend of Gary Powers. You may have heard of Francis Gary Powers, shot down over Russia on May 1, 1960. And he told me that he was flying from Pakistan up to Stavanger, Norway, and he was near Sverdlovsk, and he was at 68,000 feet, and they had been shooting at him with these SAM missiles, surface-to-air missiles, and fighters had tried to accelerate at about 35 to 40,000 and then pull up on them and zoom, but they never had shot any of them down. And but even before Powers was shot down, Kelly Johnson knew that a SAM missile had the chance to get it, and that's what got it. And so a proximity fuse came off, and Powers told me over his left shoulder he saw an illumination on the instrument panel, and then it flipped him up like this and broke in two. And the reason that's worth noting is because if you'd ejected in the normal way, we had a time delay, and then it would have blown the U-2 into smithereens, and they would have gotten big pieces out of it. But it didn't happen. He didn't use the normal way to get out, and he was in the airstream. And so I knew the pilot for King Hussein of Jordan, who said he'd been in Moscow and seen the Powers U-2, big pieces of it in there. And so then that made him prisoner. And then that was a big flap. Remember, Khrushchev came to the UN and banged his shoe on the podium and all that. And I told Powers that he's the most famous pilot in the world. Everybody on this side of the Iron Curtain's heard of, say, Lindbergh. But nobody on the other side of the Iron Curtain has heard of him. But everybody on both sides of the Iron Curtain have heard of Powers. And I said, maybe the word's not famous, but infamous. And so he got killed, unfortunately, in they made a TV thing at Channel 4, NBC, talking about Powers. And Lee Majors played him. And that's where he met the NBC guys, and so they gave him a job flying around reporting traffic in LA. And then he went from straight wing to helicopter, and he got killed in a helicopter. They had a big fire out in Santa Barbara, and all these million-dollar homes were going up in smoke, and he had a photographer. It was in about August of 77 or 8. And so he just let the photographer talk him into staying there too long, and knew it was low on gas, and he was based out of Burbank, where I'm from now. And then they knew there was shy of fuel, so they tried to land in Van Nuys, and they got down low and flamed out, and that's what killed Gary Powers. One other thing, his mother, Sue Powers, lived in Vegas, and last fall she passed away, and they have a son, Francis Gary Powers Jr., who lives over there in Northern Virginia near DC, and he called me up and said, would I please come over to Vegas from Burbank and say a few words at his mom's funeral? So I said, certainly. So I got here around noon and left at 4 after we ate some lunch, and then went to the service, and I left, and that's the quickest trip I ever made to Vegas. Now I'll talk about the SR-71. Since Kelly Johnson knew that the U-2 might be able to be shot down by a SAM even before it was, that was the origin of the concept. And by the way, the U-2 itself was CIA, so the origins of the Mach 3 stuff is CIA. And I've been told they don't want me to talk about the early CIA stuff. Typically, when something gains currency and it relates to military matters, and the policy of the Pentagon is neither to confirm nor deny any such thing that they read, say, an aviation week, otherwise known as aviation leak. And but they say, but somebody like you commenting on it, that'd be different. So I don't want to go too much into that. But it's made of titanium. One of the differences, I'm invited to speak to a lot of audiences that know a lot about the technology of aviation and so forth, the aerodynamics, the structure, and so forth. And this airplane is the design speed. It used to be we couldn't say anything about it. It was so secret for many, many years, but the design speed is 3.2 Mach. That was determined by Kelly Johnson. He determined everything. It was a one-man show. And that's because he thought he could live with that kind of temperature. And titanium can take higher temperatures than can aluminum. And that's why he used that as a structural metal. And it's about 93% titanium, the structure, titanium alloy. And so this airplane is two-engined, and you'll see in the video, which we'll show shortly. And then we can talk further about the technology of the SR-71. But I was certainly honored by Kelly to be the man he chose to be his main test pilot on the thing. And I can tell you about the first flight and stuff leading up to it. And we lost a lot of pilots and airplanes in the development of it. But once we got that thing going well, then it served 6 different presidents. And the Air Force, even today, goes around bragging that they never lost any enemy action, even though the Russians and their friends have shot at it with SAMs over 4,000 times. So, Jeremy, why don't we go ahead and run this thing, and then we can proceed. While you're setting it up, we want to dim the lights over here, too. This was designed to be something to honor Kelly in the fall of 1990 in the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. And he was too ill to go over there, so I did go over there, and here it is.
Dear Kelly, you and I have never met. I'm not a former SR-71 pilot or RSO. I wasn't a member of your design team at the Lockheed Skunk Works or on the assembly line that built the Blackbird. Nor was I a member of the Air Force at Beale, Mildenhall, or Kadena, who kept the Blackbirds flying. I'm not even an airplane buff in the classic sense. I'm just a person that had the privilege of being around your SR-71 Blackbird, and it was an experience I will remember intensely for the rest of my life. There's just something about your Blackbird, Kelly, that words don't adequately describe. Anyone who has been near a Blackbird and felt its presence knows what I'm talking about. It's a feeling in your gut, and instantly you want to be part of it. Part of what I call the Blackbird family. Today, Kelly, you are being honored for your design work on the SR-71, and justly so. To me, the SR-71 is not only your greatest aircraft design, it is perhaps the greatest aircraft ever built. I've heard it said that you considered the Blackbird the most fascinating challenge of your career. No wonder. It was a design that was so advanced that everything that touched it had to be new. New manufacturing processes, new tools, new materials, a whole new approach. You built an operational stealth aircraft a decade before most of the world had even heard the term. It was a design so far ahead of its time that it retired before time could catch up with it. In times of crisis, the Blackbird provided 6 presidents with a unique and critical view of the world. The Blackbird served this country for just over a quarter of a century. In that entire time, it stood in a class of one. To me, the Blackbird is much more than a technical marvel. It's an airplane that gets inside you, an aircraft that causes the adrenaline to flow just by looking at it. Kelly, your Blackbird is the stuff dreams are made of. It's the model plane sitting in a young child's room, proof that everything is possible, that the sky isn't the limit. And it's the poster hanging on the office wall of a middle-aged engineer, testimony that yes, even in the real world, miracles do occur. The SR-71 embodies all that excites people about aerospace. Its crew seems part pilot, part astronaut. The Blackbird itself appears part airplane, part spacecraft. The typical Blackbird fan is a cross-section of America. It's your grandfather, your niece, your son. It's the wide-eyed young kid that buys an aircraft book at the National Air and Space Museum. It's the family that traveled hundreds of miles to an air show just to see a Blackbird in person. It's the people on the Air Force base that stopped what they were doing to watch an SR take off. Everyone, every time, no matter how many times they'd seen it before. And it's the pilot who last flew the Blackbird 20 years ago, who has the look in his eye that says, I flew the best aircraft ever made. The look that can barely contain the desire to get in an SR just one more time and light the burners. When Blackbird 972 made its final record-setting flight to Dulles Airport, I watched the television with mixed emotions. This was the Blackbird's final flight. An aircraft that was the very definition of speed and power would fly no more. But my sadness was tempered by the knowledge that this plane would now truly belong to the nation, coming to rest in the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. Now millions would be able to do what I had done. Be near a Blackbird, be part of the family. Kelly, in the years to come, whenever I want to experience your airplane's majesty, I will remember the time I spent with your Blackbird. The smell of JP7 fuel, the feel of it on the soles of my shoes, the sound of an air starter wind up, the TEB ignite, and I'll put on the film that we shot during those incredible weeks in 1987. I'll watch it, feel it, be part of it again. Because in movies, Kelly, like in our memories, your Blackbird will fly forever. Congratulations, Kelly, and thank you. Devin Hawker, Assistant Cameraman, Blackbird, the movie.
You can see those shock diamonds coming out the tailpipe. It's a unique thermodynamic phenomenon. Thank you. Could we have the lights, please? I wanted to mention one thing. This program was more popular than the astronaut program, at least among a lot of people. And I know some that turned down the one for the other. They used to say on the astronaut program, you could become an astronaut. You might get one ride in, say, 5 years. And if you got into the SR-71 program, you'd get maybe 2 per week. And then in between, you could fly those T-38s. They would chase on every flight, takeoff and landing, same way we do in experimental test flight. And that's one thing. I don't know how much more time we have here. Jeremy, you checking the time? How much more time do we have?
You have 18 minutes.
18 minutes. All right, we'll have a quick question and answer here in a moment. I wish we had time to tell you about the Rutan boys. They're big buddies of mine. And I presented the Theodore von Karman Award to Bert Rutan. And by the way, Bert says my hero is Kelly Johnson. He knows all about him. Maybe you all have heard of Bert Rutan and the Voyager back in '86. It took off from Edwards and flew non-stop all around the world. That's an incredible feat aerodynamically, and even now underestimated in difficulty. But I used to meet with Kelly every Monday morning at 7 a.m. and we would go over the instrumentation we had. And he was a big believer in instrumentation. And he used to say, if you've got better instrumentation or more creative in designing your instrumentation, you don't have to be any smarter than anybody else. Anybody can figure it out. And he didn't like any oversight whatsoever. And they would never give anybody this much autonomy and authority anymore. And it all happened because he started out with CIA, didn't know anything about airplanes. But the Air Force, when they buy things, they don't do it that way. The illustration he gave me, he said, I can come to a point where I don't know whether it's better to go down Route A or Route B. He said, I can choose the wrong one and go down there and find out it's wrong and be going down the right one before these other guys finish having their meetings and sending faxes and so forth to each other. And they wouldn't let anybody else have that much authority. And that was one reason he could bring in things faster and cheaper than anywhere else, because there wasn't any of this delay. The faster you can get these things developed, then that's what really saves money on it. So maybe we open the question and answers. I know there's much more things we could talk about here, but does anyone have any questions or answers that I might answer? Yes, sir.
I'd like to know how it's possible to achieve a 12-to-1 kill ratio with pilots who had 30 hours in their aircraft when they went into combat.
I think you're referring to my comment about the Korean War. The 86 was swept wing, and the airplane I flew was straight wing. And this is despite the fact that after World War II, the Russians had lost 94% of all the casualties on the Allied side in World War II, and we had all the gold, and our industry was still there, and yet we come out with I was flying an airplane inferior to the MiG-15, which was swept wing. And that always has irked me. And Jimmy Doolittle is famous for saying, we don't mind being outnumbered. We do mind having worse equipment. But you're referring to the F-86. It had about a 10-to-1 kill ratio over the MiG, but many more 84s were shot down by MiGs because they had inferior performance, not only because they were straight wing, but because we would hang garbage under the wings. Any other questions about anything? Yes, ma'am.
What was the velocity of the Blackbird when we saw the thermodynamic diamond shocks?
I couldn't hear that, please.
What was the velocity of the Blackbird when we saw the diamond shocks?
Oh, that's subsonic. The question was when we saw the shock diamonds, what was the velocity? That is a subsonic situation, but it's the same thing might occur up high, but we didn't have anybody photographing it. The performance on this airplane, as I mentioned, is 3.2. It goes from west coast to east coast in 1 hour. And I had to demonstrate the weakest element in the whole concept, once we got everything working, is the duration of the pilot. We have enough, but with multiple refuelings. And I would take off from Edwards, go over there to South Florida, let down, hit a tanker, and in 12 minutes you can get a full load of fuel. And then you got to light your burner and be careful that you don't blow the tanker out of the sky with your burner. And away you go to the West Coast, let down, hit another tanker, and back over to Florida. I only had to do that the 4 crossings because some of these customer pilots up at Beale Air Force Base or Mildenhall in Britain or in Kadena in Okinawa, that was the main places they were based for convenience. Some of those guys went 12 and 13 hours, but I just had to do that, and it would take me, you know, about 5 hours or so to do what I just told you, the 4 crossings. Yes, sir.
Is it true that the Blackbird, by design, had to leak fuel because?
I didn't mention that. Yes, it does. And why is that? I know we have some extra experts around here in chemistry, but as I understand it, any crystalline substance that changes temperature will expand, and in so doing it weakens. And we have to factor that in our climb schedule because we're getting hotter as we're climbing to our maximum speed, which is 3.2, as I mentioned. That's about 800 F, by the way. And I think a self-cleaning oven has been told is about 425 and a soldering iron about 550. So we got some big-time heat coming out here. And you talk about the leaks. So we were trying to develop fuel tank sealants on the inside of thin-gauge titanium, which is the outer skin of the aircraft. And we couldn't do it because when you get down for the refueling at, say, 28, 29,000, it's chilly there and you're subsonic, so it shrinks in. And then when you get hot again, it expands. And so we couldn't develop a fuel tank sealant that would prevent relatively minor leaks. But the thing holds such an enormous amount of fuel, it's trivial. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
I've always heard the U-2 as sort of being a powered glider with an extremely tight envelope. In other words, you only had 1 or 2%. Is that? Could you describe that a little bit better?
Yes, I can. The question is the U-2 and its flight characteristics. Tony Levere made, my good friend who was my predecessor for Kelly Johnson, he made the first flight on the 104 and the U-2. He's now deceased about 7 years ago. But he told me that the U-2 indeed was like a sail plane with a jet engine. If you see one take off, it immediately has to climb like that or goes too fast for the NASA airfoil, NACA airfoil actually, the predecessor to NASA. And then as it keeps going higher and higher, pretty soon it gets in what they call a coffin corner where you can't go any faster and you can't go any slower. If you went any faster, you get air separation over your fat wing, and if you go any slower, you'd stall out. So it can go up, as I mentioned, up to around 68, 69,000. And then, does that answer your question?
Yes, sir.
Any other? Yes, sir.
I saw a Blackbird at an air show at Miramar once, and the sign next to it I thought was intriguing because I thought it said that the upper speed was Mach. They of course didn't want to specify anything, but they had plus symbols. So they gave the ceiling, it's 60,000 feet or 80,000 feet plus. And then it said Mach, I thought it said Mach 4 plus. What was the maximum speed on the Blackbird? The design speed is 3.2, and it's got good controllability out higher than that, say 3.5, but the temperatures will go up asymptotically, and something is going to come unglued, and we instructed all of our customer pilots, whom we call the blue suiters, that's the Air Force. We don't want anybody going except 3.2. But then when they started salvoing some of those SAMs at it, we said, okay, you can go to 3.3, but actually you're perfectly safe at 3.2. We have fancy black boxes in the back seat called ELINT gear, electronic intelligence, and it's designed to defeat the SAMs coming up with, it determines the pulse rate and the frequencies and puts out phony baloney to foul up the SAM, but you really don't need it. When you're way up there at cruise altitude and cruise Mach, two things. You don't drop a sonic boom, and I wish I had time to explain that. You don't pull a contrail. And the SAMs, as they come up, they only have a launch window of like 4.2 seconds. And they have to have a hellacious big lead angle, and then they need to describe a curve of pursuit to get a hit. And when they have to be going as fast as we are back at that time, and they can't turn in that thin air. We can't turn. True, it's a Mexican standoff in that respect. And yet they need to turn to get a hit. So that's why I wouldn't even raise my blood pressure to have these guys shooting at me. Yes, sir. Okay, this is the final question, I think, isn't it, Jeremy? We've about to run out of time. Is that correct, Jeremy? Final question.
The question is, why did they retire it? Well, the last act of Secretary of Defense Robert S. McNamara was to order Lockheed and Kelly Johnson to destroy all the jigs for making new parts. And Kelly considered that treason. I consider that treason. Remember, he's the author of this concept known as mutual assured destruction, and maybe he didn't want the Russians to get ahead, but anyway, that's his justification for doing it. So they couldn't have any more parts. And so they were running out of parts, and that's why up until very lately they had them at Edwards Air Force Base, NASA did, flying, but it's the end of the road because they don't have no parts. Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for letting me join you for this wonderful occasion. Thank you.